The scientific analog of news is variance. Things don't get interesting until they vary. And one thing that's varied in recent years is the enthusiasm of those who enforce the laws regulating various aspects of the environment. It's a hard story to cover. You can zoom back and take a historical view, as Thomas Frank of the Wall Street Journal did in his well-written polemic. You get his drift from the title, The Wrecking Crew. Or you can do daily journalism to report all the twists and turns in agency policies. This strategy concentrates on process, and that's what I call source-based journalism. But readers are more interested in outcomes. What do citizens get when people who don't like regulation are in charge of the regulation? Finding out requires collecting data. I call this evidence-based journalism. And that's what two good reporters for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel did last year when they studied the work of two agencies concerned with dangerous chemicals in food and clothing, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. Suzanne Rust in Milwaukee and Meg Kissinger in Washington covered the process by examining the close ties between the agencies and the companies they monitor. For the outcomes part, they got their newspaper to pay for independent laboratory studies to look for dangerous chemicals in consumer products, and they found them. So process and outcome, a nice balanced package, and a good example for their peers. So we're pleased to present this award of special merit to Meg Kissinger and Suzanne Rust.
Excuse me. So we're going to do this in a two-parter tonight. I'm going to start off with sort of how we got into all of this, and Meg is going to come out with the really exciting part of this talk tonight, which was the fallout from everything we've done. Oh, here's the clicker. So for the past 2 years, we've been working on a series of stories that we've given the title Chemical Fallout to. And we really have to give even before I get here, I want to thank the jurors. I wanted to thank the Metcalf Institute, the Grantham and Metcalf families for awarding with us. We're quite honored. But I also want to thank George Stanley, who's our managing editor, and who gave us all the encouragement, the resources, and the motivation to do this. I've never seen anybody as excited about stories as he was, and we owe all of this to him. All right, so how did this all get started? Well, it started out with some poop and some monkeys and some hormones. 10 years ago, I was actually a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I studied monkeys. And what I did to pay my way through graduate school was actually look at feces, monkey feces. And I extracted hormones out of them. And what we were able to do was sort of correlate behavior and different estrogen, progesterone, testosterone levels. And I thought for some reason this would be a really lucrative and interesting route to go down, so I took a class, oh wait, before I get there, called Hormones and Behavior. But I should have realized at that time I was a journalist and not a scientist, because I had to run one of the seminars. As you may know, in graduate school, professors often do one lecture at the beginning of the semester, and then they hand it over to the grad students to do the rest. But I based my entire lecture on a New Yorker article. I actually didn't go to the scientific literature. I went to my favorite magazine, and I found this article called Silent Sperm. It was a fascinating article. It's focused on a researcher in Denmark named Niels Skakebæk, who had been looking at sperm quantity and quality for several decades, and he had seen a precipitous drop in both the quality and quantity of sperm in Danish men. And his sort of concluding hypothesis was that there were chemicals in the environment that men were being exposed to. It was upsetting their hormone levels and reducing the amount of sperm they had. At the same time, a book called Our Stolen Future came out, which did sort of the same thing, except it looked at wildlife. I was really fascinated in this research, but things happened, and 10 years later, I found myself in the newsroom of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and that's supposed to be a time capsule. I didn't actually go through space. Anyway, so I'd been sort of following this just as an interested reporter. I would occasionally report on studies that came out about endocrine disruptors. But in 2007, in the spring, the LA Times broke a story that the Environmental Working Group had been who gave them the tip on this, which showed that there was a panel with the Center for the Evaluation of Risks to Human Reproduction. It's a long panel name. They were reviewing a chemical called bisphenol A. They contracted out the collection of papers and the writing of their draft report to a company that had clients that included BASF, Dow Chemical, DuPont, Chevron, et cetera, all bisphenol A makers. So I wrote a story about this, and here we come back to my favorite guy, George Stanley, who said, this is really interesting. I think there might be a really good series of stories here on endocrine disruptors and government action. So he told me to go around the newsroom and pick out the people I wanted to work with on this. So first I went to Meg Kissinger, who is the most phenomenal reporter on the planet, and a ton of fun to work with. I actually didn't know she was a ton of fun to work with at the time, but I kind of figured it out, and we've had a blast. I also looked at Kerry Spivak, well, didn't look at him. I asked him to join us as well. He's a business investigative reporter. I'm not real business savvy. I was a scientist again, and so called him on to help us with some stuff, excuse me. And Mark Hatches, who was a new investigative editor at our paper. First thing we did was we decided to see what the government was doing about endocrine disruptors, went to their own website, which showed us that they hadn't done much of anything. So in 1996, they decided they'd look into this and start controlling them. By 2007, they'd had 4 iterations of a panel, but still hadn't done anything, hadn't reviewed any single one of the chemicals they were supposed to. We did a really broad sort of look at government panels that were looking at this, government agencies that were looking at this, but we decided we'd also hyper-focus on this chemical that I already mentioned, bisphenol A. Whoops. Anyway, which you find in baby bottles and which babies drink. I don't know why I had to show you that picture. That's pretty self-explanatory that babies drink out of baby bottles. But you also find it in a ton of other things. It's probably in this. It's in eyeglasses. It's in protective gear, et cetera, et cetera. And I went to the original scientific literature, pulled 258 studies that looked at the effect of this chemical on animals with spines in laboratories. Might sound a little arbitrary, but it actually wasn't. And we found that 80% of academic and government studies found that this chemical was dangerous. 9 out of 10 industry-funded studies showed that there was no harm. Okay, so I got a little confused here. So 9 out of 10 industry studies showed there were no harm. What we were able eventually to show was that most of the studies showed that there was harm in this chemical. I'm sort of not going to give you, we spent another year working on this chemical, on other programs, looking at how the government was being influenced by industry. And in the fall of 2008, this is sort of another big one, the FDA decided to take a look at the chemical. And they ended up saying it was safe, but they basically based their whole analysis on 2 industry-funded studies. They also decided that they would get a subcommittee to come and look at their analysis because there had been a lot of fallout. They wanted a peer review of it. And Meg will get into sort of the exciting part about that. But essentially, should I go into this?
Yeah.
Essentially, they called together this panel. The head of the panel was a man named Martin Filbert, who is a toxicologist at the University of Michigan. He works for the Center for Risk Assessment. The Center for Risk Assessment had just received a $5 million grant, which was more than they ever get, from a man who was a big anti-regulationist, who was considered the second worst polluter in Michigan, and who had told Filbert that he thought bisphenol A was safe. So I'm going to leave that at that, and Meg's going to do the more exciting part.
Imagine that we were not on the American Chemistry Council's Christmas card list anymore. They're not too happy with us. But we started writing these stories showing the bias that the federal agency had to studies conducted with money paid for by the bisphenol A makers themselves. And it doesn't take any scientific background to know that that just doesn't smell right. And so while these stories were coming out, in a conventional way, they were also making a big splash in the blogosphere and on the internet. And as a reporter who's been in the business for 30 years, it's just kind of fascinating for me to think of how these stories had a much farther reach, today's technology being what it was. So our audience was really well beyond the Milwaukee borders. And anyway, so that was kind of fun to know that our stories were having a wide reach. And Bill Moyers and his people came calling, and back in February, a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, they came out and watched us in action, which we thought, good luck finding anything exciting about that. But anyway, out they came, and in Milwaukee in February for a week, and we think that the camera guy might still be stuck to a fire hydrant on Kinnick Avenue. But anyway, the show aired May of 2008, and so more letters and emails poured in, and people seemed very impressed that a mid-sized Midwestern newspaper would devote that kind of time and money to this topic. And then we went Ivy League. Columbia University did a case study on our reporting methods, and they seemed especially impressed that we would dispatch Suzanne to scour these 258 scientific studies. It's not your usual, newspaper story where you go out and quote the man in the street. And then the awards started rolling in, which we were thrilled about. We got the John B. Oakes award. Oh, my husband did this PowerPoint. He's so silly. He thought that would be really cool to show it rolling up on the screen. And then, ta-da, Sigrid Takai, and then Scripps Howard, and then the Polk Award, and then we were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting, and that was all really exciting. And at the same time, things were really heating up politically. Oh, we have to do this again. Here we go. So Long Island was the first, followed by Chicago, and then Minnesota and Connecticut. And these states and cities were enacting bans against BPA for baby bottles. Now, the blogs were crackling about worries about BPA, and baby bottle makers said that they would begin phasing out using the chemical in making their products. And last April, Sunoco, one of the few BPA makers in the country, informed their customers that they would not sell this chemical anymore to make baby bottles. So we knew that our stories, we weren't the only ones reporting this, but we were certainly, among the most aggressive. Well, that brings us to last May, right here in Washington, D.C., at the swanky Cosmos Club. They held a meeting, the plastics lobby, the makers of BPA, very unhappy about our coverage. And they had a secret meeting, or what they thought was a secret meeting, to talk about strategy and how publicity, the stories that we were writing were hurting the sales. We're talking about a $6 billion industry, and their sales were being affected by stories like ours. And so when they got together at the Cosmos Club, they talked about what it would take to put a good face on this chemical. And they decided that the ultimate would be to find a pregnant woman to talk about the benefits of BPA, and this person would become known as the Holy Grail. Well, 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 as I said, we found out about it and got copies of the summary of the meeting and had a front page story the next day, and now they were really angry. Congress, too, having read our story, and then the day after our story, the Washington Post, you might have heard of that newspaper, they had the story as well. And so the Congressional Committee on Energy and Commerce sent a letter to industry leaders saying, what's this about this meeting? We want details. And a congressional investigation had been launched. So what started out as a drizzle was shaping up to be a storm. And Suzanne and I held our breath and waited for the next bolt of lightning. Ta-da! And it came 2 weeks later when Trevor Butterworth wrote a blistering 27,000-word screed on the media's treatment of the safety of BPA. He singled us out for leading the charge on calling BPA's safety into question. 27,000 words. This was no casual musing or light academic exercise. It was clearly meant to discredit us. And that got us thinking, who's Trevor Butterworth? And who is he? What is the Statistical Assessment Center? What's the Center for Media and Public Affairs? That's an organization that shares the same office, the same tax forms, and many of the same office and many of the same officers. And they were claiming, falsely, that we relied only on a handful of scientists when a thorough reading of our 2 years' worth of stories quotes more than 3 dozen. And why did they go after the judges of those awards that we won? claimed that they too were part of a campaign to scare American consumers. Okay, so we started digging, and our digging took us to the bowels of the Tobacco Institute, and this is where we learned that the Center for Media and Public Affairs had been, oh yeah, there we go, thanks, had been paid by the tobacco industry to look at their media strategy on the dangers of cigarette smoking. One of the documents showed a media strategy that included tracking individual reporters and how they covered the controversy. It felt oddly familiar in a very icky way. Anyway, we continued, scrutinized financial disclosures and found that the person who wrote the benchmark study hadn't disclosed his ties to the California EPA. And this is the diagram that we came up with, which we tried to make look like a baby bottle, but it really looks like an eye chart for an alien with two pupils. But it shows the tobacco industry and the chemical industry sharing, as I just said previously, lobbyists and a media strategy. And anyway, this controversy is not going to die lightly, and it continues to broil on. And just 2 weeks ago, 36 scientists sent a letter to the FDA urging them to get on with it and take a look at and enough already with the studies. There's been plenty of studies out there. And I put this last one in there because it just looked funny. And in Milwaukee, we like beer. And so if they ever do get rid of baby bottles, we hope they don't drink out of bottles like this. But anyway, we thank you.